Larry Wright is not from Austin, but we claim him anyway. Born and raised in Dallas, Texas, he attended Tulane University and later earned a Master of Arts degree from the American University in Cairo. He started writing for Texas Monthly in 1980 and quickly made a name for himself for his features and profile stories.
Larry is a man of many talents, a musician, a playwright, a screenwriter, and a novelist. He is perhaps best known for his meticulously researched investigative journalism, as seen in books like The Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda and the Road to 9/11, which was published in 2006 and won a Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction, Going Clear, Scientology, Hollywood, and the Prison of Belief, published in 2013, and his most recent book, one of particular relevance to this luncheon this year, The Plague Year, America in the Time of COVID, which was published last summer.
A longtime staff writer for The New Yorker and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Society of American Historians, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Larry is uniquely qualified to talk about the cultural, historical, and scientific dimensions of the 21st century's first pandemic. We are very excited to have Larry as our featured guest for this year's event. And we're also grateful that our longtime friend, Evan Smith, CEO and co-founder of the Texas Tribune, could join us to visit with Larry.
Larry, good to be with you. Good to see you.
Evan, it's always good to be with you.
Strange to live so close to each other and not actually see each other, but this is actually one of those moments when I get to come see you, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to do it. I just wish it were more often.
Me too.
We are indeed here, sitting here in the third year of this pandemic. And while the public health emergency has largely dissipated, people are still getting COVID. Right? I mean, as much as, we're all tired of the protocols and tired of the precautions, there are still things that are in place and need to be in place. I wonder if way back at the beginning when you were working on your novel, The End of October, which obviously was extraordinarily amazing and predicting effectively what we were going to go through, and then the book, which was The Plague Year, which was really the nonfiction telling of the story. Did you at that time have any inkling that The Plague Year would ultimately be plague years plural?
Well, I might have titled it differently.
Right.
I did, in the sense that I always, all the public health people compared this to the 1918 flu.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the 1918 flu, it was the 1918, 1919, 1920 flu.
Right.
And
we've just branded it as if it were short term.
Right. So it lasted, and then it mutated and became a different kind of flu.
Yep.
And then it came back 50 years later, and then another 20 years after that. So it recurs. But I had a sense that, with this coronavirus, it's not influenza, but it is a chronic virus.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're kind of stuck with it, I believe, in one form or another.
There has been over the last 2+ years a lot of focus on the origins of this virus. Who is to blame? What is to blame? I don't feel like after 2 years I can say I know. And my question is, do you know? Will we ever know? Does it matter? Should we care? Or is it immaterial at this point?
We might know one day. There are two plausible scenarios about how this virus emerged. And one is it was like SARS-1, which 2009, it came out of bats. It went through an intermediate animal, another mammal, that was probably sold in a wet market in Guangdong and passed into a human and became a human disease. And because we know, because it was shown in bats to be a very similar disease and in other animals, that's a very plausible scenario.
Right.
And that was, so when this SARS-2, as it's known, and the virus that causes the disease, COVID-19, it was thought something similar to that happened. It came out of bats, and there is a bat virus that is very similar to the one that infects humans. Maybe it went into a wet market in Wuhan, which is what they first thought, and then passed from an intermediate animal, possibly a pangolin or a raccoon dog that was sold in the market for consumption, and then into humans.
Right.
That's plausible, but not proven. The other scenario is that there are actually two virology institutes in Wuhan, one more famous than the other, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Both collect bat viruses and analyze them. And at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it is a biosafety level 4 facility. That's the kind of place where people walk around in spacesuits and, manipulate viruses inside glass boxes with these thick gloves. But they were doing experiments in that facility. They weren't at level 4 spacesuits. They were at level 2, which is about what you'd find in a dentist office. And they were taking bat viruses and doing what were called gain of function tests. The object is to determine what would it take to make this a human virus. And one way of doing that is you take a virus from a bat, for instance, and you put it in the nose of a ferret, which is much more human-like than a bat. And you make that ferret sick. He gets infected from the bat. And then you take a sample from that ill ferret and give it to another ferret, and then see how many passes it would take to make it into a disease that passes freely from one ferret to another. If it does that, it is very much like a human disease. Mm-hmm. And there was a famous experimenter in the Netherlands, Ron Fouchier, who did that with H5N1, the very virus that right now is in poultry all over the United States. Millions of chickens and turkeys have been killed to prevent its spread. But H5N1, people do catch it from poultry or from birds. And when that happens, 60% of the people who get it die. So Fouchier was using that ferret example that I told you. It only took 3 passes to make it into what was a plausible human disease. So in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they're doing experiments very similar to that.
Yeah.
And U.S. intelligence suggests that 3 people in that lab in November of 2019 checked into the hospital with COVID-19 symptoms. And, there are other examples of, how this may have passed through.
Right, but what I'm not hearing is anything that would be malicious. It sounds like it was incompetence, maybe, right?
I'll tell you,
Or lack of care taken.
I don't subscribe to either theory, but I do think what is malicious is the Chinese behavior in covering it up.
Right.
And, with the first SARS epidemic, they hid it from the world. World health authorities went to China to investigate what was going on with the first SARS outbreak.
Yeah.
And Chinese authorities actually hid the patients in ambulances and taxis until the authorities went away.
Right.
And World Health regulations were rewritten to take into account the obfuscation. And Chinese behavior in this instance is what makes that second theory that I just enunciated much more plausible, because they shut down labs that were doing work on COVID-19. Mm-hmm. They punished scientists that talked about it.
Right.
They humiliated people on television. They forced doctors not to wear masks in hospitals because they would give the wrong impression where they were actually getting sick and dying in hospitals.
As we contemplate what happened looking back, it seems like there were 3 things that we lacked. Preparation, in that there was no playbook. Now, you point out, ironically, there was a playbook, but we just chose not to ignore it. So we didn't actually base our reaction to this on the basis of a playbook. Even though there was a playbook, we became, we were unprepared at the beginning of this. We lacked execution, in that when it came time for us to put testing regimens in place or distribution of vaccines or whatever else, that we seemed woefully unable to pull that part off. And then there was, just generally speaking, lack of leadership.
Yeah.
And it was errors of commission and errors of omission on the leadership side, active sabotaging of efforts to deal with this, or just complete checking out and not doing anything. Like the classic perfect storm of all these things combined.
That a good example of that is that Matt Pottinger, who was a National Security Council.
Big character in your book.
Yeah.
Right.
He happened to have been a reporter, which I think is key. The American intelligence community had no idea about this. They didn't see it coming, and when they did see it coming, they didn't think it was going to be serious.
Right.
Matt had been in China reporting for the Wall Street Journal during the SARS epidemic. And so he called some of his sources. He speaks Chinese, he speaks Mandarin.
Yeah.
And so they told him, wash your hands, socially distance and all that, but if you want to put the brakes on this thing, you have to mask up. It's the only thing you can do. And so he became an advocate for masks and finally persuaded the public health contingent and people on the National Security Council that this was a good thing to do. And they talked the president into, supporting it.
Finally.
And then he goes on TV and says, holds up a mask and says, I've been told that this is, will help. And, maybe you should wear it. I'm not going to wear it.
I'm personally not going to do it. Exactly.
Then he visits a mask making factory without a mask.
Without a mask on.
And they had to destroy all the masks in the room because he might have contaminated them.
Right.
That was an example of the kind of leadership we had. But I also want to counter that by saying the Trump administration did one thing that was very important, which was Operation Warp Speed.
Right, the vaccine development process they deserve credit for.
They do, because it was unprecedented. They guaranteed the pharmaceutical companies that they would be reimbursed for their investment in vaccines, whether they worked or not.
Right.
And because of that, in part, we were able in the fall of 2020, the fall of 2019, to have vaccines underway. And so, think about the country would have been like if we had no vaccines at all during the entirety of 2020, when Delta and Omicron come along and they're massively contagious and we had no defense.
How much worse would we be sitting here today in year 3?
Yeah.
Right? Quickly, before we wrap this, Larry, the story of the last 2+ years has been a story over and over of bumblers, people who did not get this right.
Yeah.
Who are the heroes, beyond the frontline workers who have been at the forefront of getting all of us back up on our feet, healthy, treating our families, dealing with us, often at their own cost and expense, and in some cases losing their own lives in the process. Who are the heroes? I mean, I'm struck this week as we sit here. Dr. Fauci made the point in one interview, the pandemic is largely over, and then had to basically walk. Even Dr. Fauci is kind of caught up. Of course, he's been a controversial figure for this whole time. Who are the people who you think about over these 2+ years as the people who got it right, who are the heroes of this?
There are a lot of them, but just what comes to mind, first of all, Barney Graham. Barney is an immunologist at the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, which is Dr. Fauci's shop.
Right.
And he and Jason McClellan, who is a structural biologist, a new field in medicine, who came into Barney's lab, created the vaccine in 3 days. Now, how did they do that? They had been working on other coronaviruses, MERS and SARS. And so they had a template. And they had learned, thanks to structural biology and this advanced imaging, they could actually see in the smallest levels of the virus. Imagine, back in 1918, they couldn't even see viruses.
Right.
They didn't have the concept of a virus. But they were able to see the spike, which elongates and like a harpoon when it goes in and attaches to the cell. They were able to tie the spike down and use that as the vaccine.
Yeah.
So the body recognizes the spike protein and your immune system charges in. The spike protein you're given in the vaccine is totally harmless.
Wow.
So in 3 days, they are able to take the template they've been working on with other coronaviruses, apply it to SARS-CoV-2, the COVID-19 vaccine virus, and 6 months later, Moderna started human trials.
Yeah.
Then, there's so many healthcare workers that I talk to, and at Bellevue Hospital, America's first public health institution, for instance, they don't turn away anybody. And other hospitals knew that, and they would unload their COVID patients on them because, they were all being choked full of. And so Bellevue managed to, survive this incredible first wave in New York and handle it and set an example for all the other hospitals at the cost of course, some of their staff who died. And then there are doctors like Ebony Hilton who, she's an anesthesiologist at the University of Virginia. But to intubate patients is one of the most intimate acts you can perform as a doctor because you have to get right into their nasal passages and she did this night after night, day after day, oftentimes the only anesthesiologist in the hospital, and having to sequester herself from everybody else. So she lived alone with her dogs, didn't see her family for a couple of years, and actually, like many healthcare workers, because hospitals stopped doing discretionary medicine and surgery, she suffered a pay cut. I also think some of the governors, some of them behaved, with great insight and courage, and
At great risk.
At great risk themselves. So, I think it's been a test, and I'd like to think, I spoke to this interesting woman, Gianna Pomata, who's a historian of diseases. And she used to be at Johns Hopkins. She lives in Bologna, Italy. And I called her and asked, what pandemic in the past would you compare this to? And she said the Black Plague in the 13th century in Italy, not because of the death rate, which was far greater. It killed a third of Europe, but just because it changed the mentality, and this was the Middle Ages, and medicine was in part built on astrology, and so the doctors were conferring about the placement of Venus in the heavens and stuff like that when people were dying of the plague, but that experience caused doctors to become more experiential. What's actually happening in front of us? And they abandoned some of their old core beliefs, the influence of religion and astrology on their science. And also finances were changed. It was the era when there were serfs and people were subjugated, they were confined, they fled their farms and into the cities. All of Europe and all of life changed, and that was the opening to the Renaissance. And Gianna, doesn't really think that we're going to have a Renaissance, but a shift in thinking about who we are and what. And I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, this is kind of like an X-ray of our society. You can see all the broken places. We're not the country that report depicted in October of 2019. We're a totally different country, and we know it now. And it's an opportunity to fix the broken parts of our society. And it's also, I think, COVID-19 is a harbinger of what's to come, because whether it was created in a lab or in nature, we're going to see more pandemics in the future. If you look back at just since the turn of the millennium, we've had Zika and West Nile and Ebola and Nipah and bird flu and SARS, just one after another at a faster rate. Society's having to cope with that. And I think that this experience has taught us something about the need for science to be ready, for our society to be prepared. So in a way, you could also think of it as a gift, because if those things happen, at least we now know what to do.
Yeah. Let's hope for whatever silver linings we can take away from this.
That's right.
Larry, we're out of time. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Good to be with you.